bonjour. This is Adnan Hussein, Director of the School of Religion at Queen's University and Director of the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project. Welcome back to the Majlis. We have here a really special guest to give us an update on a topic and an issue that we have followed here on the Majlis in the past, the Justice for Soli campaign. And we have the person who's most fundamentally behind it, somebody who I really admire and respect for the passion for justice and the fortitude to continue for 5 long years advocating on behalf of accountability and justice for those suffering mental health. And that is Brother Lucie Faqiri. Welcome to the Majlis.
Great to be here, Dr. Hussein.
Yeah, well, listeners are somewhat familiar with the story if they've heard previous episodes. We talked with you and the director and writer, Yusuf Zine, of the Unascertained podcast that chronicled the story and the investigation of the death of your brother, Soleiman, and the campaign to seek accountability. But I think it would be really useful to have, in your words, a brief synopsis of who your brother was, what happened to him, and then the struggles that you and your family have gone through in trying to find out what happened and to advocate for justice and accountability. Maybe if you could just give us a little bit of an introduction to this topic.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Peace and blessings be upon all of you, respected brothers and sisters in humanity. You know, it's very fitting, Dr. Hussein, that we're talking about Soli's story as we, in the 5-year anniversary, when he was taken away from us. You know, one of the biggest mistakes we all too often make, all of us, we're all guilty of it, and we do it in a benign way, is, you know, we allow the mental illness to effectively be the whole part of that individual. And Soleiman, and you know, and Soleiman did not allow that to the person that he was. So I want to backtrack first. You know, one of your questions was, you know, who was Soleiman? He was a teacher to so many of us, in the sense that, like, you know, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia at the peak of his life. In many respects, he was studying engineering at Waterloo, University of Waterloo. He was a gifted athlete. He had everything going for him, alhamdulillah. But God had different plans for him, and we accept those plans for him. But Soleiman, you know, did not allow the illness of that we call schizophrenia to define him. Rather, he forced us to look beyond that. And so for all the audience, when they're hearing about Soli's story, or when they know someone that's suffering from a form of mental illness, be careful when you talk to someone with mental illness on how you know, how you're, you know, in terms of how you look at them, because that illness is just part of them. They're much richer than that. They're much gifted. They're much more beautiful than just that. And Soli taught us that. So I wanted to start with that part. And that part usually is the hardest for me, because my brother was an incredible man. He was a beautiful uncle. I mean, he was an incredible son to my mom. He taught her how to read. You know, as I was getting closer to my faith, he's the one that taught me how to pray. Now imagine, I was the older brother. He is the one that I looked up to, right? And so that's who Soli was, and there's so much to talk about him in terms as a person. And frankly, Dr. Hussein, the reason that we're able to have gone all these 5 years, one is because of Canadians across this country that helped my family, but also because of that sheer and intense love that we had for my late brother, right? And I want everybody to know that anyone who's suffering around you, I know you have that same kind of love as well, right? And for people to know that people with mental illness, they deserve dignity and respect. And it's fit. And I want to segue to that, is that Soleiman, you know, he was taken to this jail called the Central East Correctional Center. In layman terms, we call it the Lindsay super jail. Lindsay super jail. The police weren't supposed to take him to jail to begin with. They were supposed to take him to a hospital. 3 days before his tragic death, my father and I made arrangements vis-a-vis a court-ordered judge to transfer Soleiman to a hospital. The only reason he was not able to make it was because he was waiting for a bed. Now, I want to be respectful to the audience time and your time, Dr. Hussein, so I'm not going to get into too much of the details. You told me just to give you a brief, and we can talk about some of the details. But since the last 5 years, you've had an eyewitness to his killing. You've had 2 coroner's reports, the most recent by Chief Pathologist, Dr. Michael Polanin, who articulated that the guards' actions were directly related to Soleiman's death. That Soleiman had 50 bruises, legs and hands were tied, pepper sprayed twice, and more than half a dozen guards were involved in his beating death. You have now 3 police investigations. One, the local police force refusing to press charges, who did not even speak with the eyewitness. And then the coroner's office, to their credit, started a second investigation to get with respect to the OPP. OPP took 20 months in their investigation, said we cannot press charges, you know this very well, because we do not know which guard gave the fatal blow. And then in August 2021, you have the chief pathologist that then made his ruling, and the case is now back with the OPP. And just a couple of days ago, one of the Canadian journalists by the name of Shanifa Nasser with the CBC reached out to the OPP. She shared on her social media the OPP's response, and the OPP gave a boilerplated response saying that this is due to an impending coroner's inquest and something with legal and means a necessary investigation. We're not able to comment. That's more that the OPP has said, Dr. Hussein, since August 2021. Since then, they have not talked to us. They have not said a word to us since August 2021. Right. So we don't even know if they're doing a criminal investigation. So I would like, and the final, to say the final few words in terms of this question is, we still don't know what they're doing. They're still operating in a very opaque, insular way, and frankly, this is problematic because we, the public, all have a right to know. I mean, it's one thing, the public is something as family too, but so we do not know, Dr. Hussein, what they're even doing in their investigation. And most of the guards that were involved in Soleiman's beating death, sir, are still employees of the Ontario government.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, well, that's a sobering synopsis that I just want to highlight a few points, that there have been several inquests to look at the forensic evidence. There have been several investigations, but there have been no charges, no, blame, given, other than the latest report by the head coroner in the province indicated finally that there, was responsibility by the guards for the death of Soleiman. But since that statement in August this last summer, there's been no clear indication of progress in an investigation on that basis in the last several months. So we're at this stage where and I think it's important to point out that the only reason why there were 3 investigations is because the campaign that you have been a part of has insisted on answers, and new evidence that they've overlooked has come to light, and so they've had to reopen the case, conduct new investigations. But from the very start, it seems like nobody wanted to really take responsibility and find out what really happened except you and your family. And it's through struggling that there's some answers have started to come, some evidence has started to come to light over the course of a 5-year process. I mean, that should be astonishing to people, that someone dies in prison, in custody, when they should have received treatment in a very brutal and violent fashion, and nobody has been held accountable. And it's been very difficult to even push for investigations and for the evidence to actually be presented in public light.
You know, Dr. Hussein, I really appreciate you bringing it back to earth to the audience. You know, of the preposterous nature of how the police has handled this case. And I want to also, but scale back a little back here. Is like, imagine now, Dr. Hussein, that you're a single mother, you're someone from the First Nations community, or someone with a certain socioeconomic background. What about them, Dr. Hussein? We've had Canadians supporting my family, and one of the great things that I'm grateful is that we have a very close-knit family. Not all families have those privileges, Dr. Hussein. Now imagine how they would deal with it, what they would go through. So I want to also highlight that, is that we've been proactive, and yes, we have amazing people helping us and supporting us. If we are having this much struggle, what about others that don't have the same privilege? And then also to keep in mind, there seems to be a very clear-cut notion that there's a standard for you and I, us in the population, and for law enforcement. That is to say that there's two different standards. There's a two-tier system, right? When is the last time, Dr. Hussein, that you hear someone who is a jail guard that's been charged criminally? You would have to work really hard, look hard to find that out. It's rare. It's very rare. And on top of all this, you have the eyewitness, Mr. John Thibault, that has been called credible by the OPP themselves. You now have the chief pathologist, Dr. Michael Polanin, to his credit, saying that the guards' actions were directly related to Soleiman's death. What is taking the police so long, Dr. Hussein? And on top of all this, what excuse will they find now not to press charges? I mean, I'll be very candid with you. I'm not, for me, I don't have, until they do the right thing, doctors, I don't have confidence in them doing the right thing. I want them to prove to me and my family, but to all Canadians, that there isn't a different standard for us and law enforcement. And the thing that makes all of this tragic, this was a human being. My mom suffers every day. My mom asks me the same question every day, Yusuf. Do you think there'll be charges as to what happened to my son? Soleiman was buried 5 years ago, but we die every single day because of his tragedy. Where's our closure? Right? But I also want to end this off in this question, is that this isn't about just my brother anymore, Dr. Hussein. A couple of days ago, 5 Canadian senators, I don't know if you saw, put out a statement standing in solidarity with the Justice for Soli movement from different parts of Canada. The senators were, and they told people that this is a national concern. It's a national concern in terms of the criminalization of people with mental illness within the justice system. 5 senators, and I'm happy to send you that statement, Dr. Hussein. And so, yes, it's a national concern. And Soleiman's story is one part of that story in this national concern. And that's why this movement is not just for Soleiman Faqiri. It's for all Canadians who suffer from mental illness. And that's what this work has now evolved into, Dr. Hussein.
Well, I have to say that is one thing that is very impressive about the Justice for Soli campaign over these last 5 years, is that it has really placed on the national agenda the question of mental health, illness, and treatment in the prisons. And as a result, it has attracted people maybe we never would have heard about, but through the Justice for Soli campaign, you've managed to highlight the issues and also allow others who have suffered grave losses as a result of the mistreatment of people who are suffering mental illness or drug, addictions, and need support and treatment more than they need this, incarceration and mistreatment in the prison system. People like, well, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the kinds of people you have met and the window that your struggle and campaign to bring justice and accountability for your brother has led you to, to come to know and to allow the public to come to know. How common is this problem, and what are the stories of people besides Soleiman who we've heard about? Who are, what are some of the other people who have suffered as a result of this kind of mistreatment?
I wish I could say it's very uncommon. It's not. It's very common, Dr. Hussein. It's and I'm just going to highlight some of them for you, because every story has a tragedy. Every story has a loved one or many loved ones that suffer after that tragedy. And every story, every death could definitely be preventable. And it's due to the failures of the system in the maltreatment of people with mental illness and the opaqueness of the system, the lack of transparency within the system. And you look at the story of Justin Saint-Amour. He had schizophrenia. He was in the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. He died about a week and a half before Soli. 2 months after Soli's death, there was a story of Cascadis suffering from schizophrenia. He died at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. There's a tragic story of Jordan Sherrod, who died in June 2020. There was some drug issues. For me, Dr. Hussein, that in itself, you need to have the appropriate people, social workers, mental health workers, to help them, not put them in jail, right? People that are suffering from a form of mental illness. You have the tragic story that a lot of people in Ontario don't know about, but through our work we found out, is like the tragic story of Edward Snowshoe, a First Nations man that spent hundreds of days in solitary confinement, ended up taking his life away because it was too hard. He was in his 20s, and his mom made a comment one time. I saw her in an interview. It's like, they would treat animals better. Edward Snowshoe, and there's an important piece in the Globe and Mail about that story. There's the tragic story, the most infamous story, one would argue, of Ashley Smith. Ashley Smith, in which guards watched her take her life. And a lot of these stories, whether it's Ashley Smith's family or Jordan Sherrod's family or Justin Saint-Amour's family, we've had conversations. We always say we're an exclusive club, that we should not even have a club to begin with. There's a tragic story. You will not find an article about his tragedy. Stephen Duffy. I speak with his sister, Vicky Stone. This man ended up leaving jail and ended up freezing to death. And there's the story of Abdulrahman Hassan, whose inquest was just was pushed back, but he died at the Central East in June 2015, suffering from schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Very tragic story. You probably find maybe 2 to 3 articles about his tragedy. There's the story of Matthew Hines. There's the story of Moses Beaver, a First Nations man who was an artist. He died in the Thunder Bay jail. Matthew Hines was suffering from seizures. He died in the East Coast. I mean, I could go on, Dr. Hussein, with many other names, but there's important themes here. There's a direct nexus between the justice system and mental illness, or that we call a fatal nexus between mental illness and the incarceration system. This is not a policy issue, Dr. Hussein. These are lives that we're talking about. These are people. This is flesh and blood, right? I'm sorry to articulate it in that descriptive way. And if we don't fix this, what will our children or our grandkids see to us one day? And this is a criticism on all of us, on myself, yourself, and anyone who's listening. This is on us as well, to have a paradigm shift. Because if we don't, we will regret this. And on top of this, you don't need to look too far, Dr. Hussein, in terms of this exact moment. This pandemic has highlighted the mental health issues You have outbreaks in prisons, you know, and that in itself should be a profound reminder to us that there's so much work. How do you have outbreaks in prisons and you don't have people that are held accountable for those outbreaks? We need to educate ourselves, but we need to turn that education into policy decisions, and those policy decisions need to be held into accountability. And I'm sorry if I'm digressing, Dr. Hussein, but these things we're unpacking complex things, but very simple things. They're both. But more than anything, lives are at stake. Put everything else aside, lives are at stake. And what this movement will humbly do, whether we do it in our lifetime, we hope to prepare the baton for someone else to take it home one day. I made a promise to my brother, may God have mercy on us. When I see him every Friday, when I go to his grave when I can, I say, I will fight until I take my last breath. Fighting for him and others is honoring him, Dr. Hussein.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say fight does not mean just combative. It's linked to dignity. It's linked to honor. It's linked to building a better society. And that's what the Soleimans and all the other names that I mentioned would want for us to do.
Absolutely. It seems that it's an amana, as one would say. It's a trust, an immense responsibility. This cannot, of course, have been easy, not only to suffer this grievous loss yourself, but to have to struggle for so long in this continuing campaign just to get information, just to get answers, to try and have accountability. What kinds of things have sustained you, in this, and to carry this heavy trust, this heavy burden? And I know also that it must have been somehow meaningful to expand the scope, to involve and to meet these other families. What has that been like? How has that helped you? And how has the campaign for justice for Soli helped others to be able to sustain this very difficult task that I'm sure has been such an emotional challenge over these years, with so many frustrations because of the roadblocks? I just want to say it should never have taken any effort on your part to find out what happened and to seek justice. This should have been the responsibility of those in authority. But you've had to take on this burden. What has that been like, and what has it meant to have this wider community to share in this struggle?
Dr. Hussein, you talk about the roadblocks, and I'm gonna get to the other part of your question as well. Like, the first investigation was done by the Port Lakes Police Service when they decided to now press charges. They made my family work hard for months to get the police report. They denied us the original police report. Our lawyers had to fight for it to get it. That's just one part of the story.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and again, if we put it at the micro level, what if somebody didn't have a lawyer? What if didn't have the means, right? And that's problematic in itself, right? What do we see in our society when people are vulnerable are given to their families in body bag and said, yeah, take them, bury them, and that's it. That's the way a lot of people are treated when it comes to this space, right? And so that's an example of the roadblock. And the only thing that kept us going, Dr. Hussein, there's some folks in this podcast that probably knows this tradition that you also know, is that there's a saying in our tradition, I believe that there's a saying in the three Abrahamic traditions, is that behind every test there is a blessing, and behind every blessing there is a test. And so for me, this has been a very painful and lonely journey. I'll be very candid for you, because painful lonely in the sense that there's some amazing and incredible people that lifted me and my family, but the loneliness in the sense of, only people that have gone through what we're going through could relate, and that's where those other families come in, right? So those conversations has allowed me to have a family in that capacity, right? When we talk about, because these are such intense, violent, traumatic experiences that you could only really relate with them. right? And so, and that's what those people, those wonderful other family, like Ashley Smith's family, you know, or Jordan's mom, you know, or Justin St. Demour's mom, Noreen, like we've had, or Vicky, like Steven's sister, having those conversations, and her, them cheering us on meant the world. It means that we're on the right track, right? It means that we're on the right track. But and then in terms of what sustained, it's an ironic paradox, but it's also, we say in Arabic, maktub, and that he wrote it this way, is that I don't often talk about this in detail, but I think it's pertinent that I talk about it in our session. Soleiman, I wasn't always practicing. It was only a few years before his tragic killing that I became closer to my faith. And he's the one that taught me about my faith. So in many ways, Dr. Hussein, he actually helped me with the blueprint. He gave me the blueprint. And that blueprint manifested in the way of, you know, of me never forgetting that no matter what I do, if my intentions are to build that society in the hopes of pleasing our creator for that better society, then that's all we can do. And that's what kept me. You know, all those down times, those tears and those pain, the thing that helped me, that lifted me up, is this idea that you must keep going, because you can only control your efforts. The results are not up to you. And then in the real world, lifting up was Canadians. I wrote a piece a couple of months ago when I said it was Canadians that lifted us up. And that's what that for me was the key that kept us going. I mean, Dr. Hussein, I've traveled across the nation. I've been all the way from BC to the other side of the country. We've had probably more than 200 interviews in the last 5 years. And it's a true honor to utter the name of my late brother and share his story. And having people saying to me, keep going. We know what you're dealing with, right? They lifted us up. Because this Soleiman's story has its unique nuances, but in many respects, it's not unique as well. It's not. And that's the problem that we have.
Indeed, yeah. I had wanted to talk. I'm glad you mentioned the article that you wrote in the Globe and Mail, because I think it made a very powerful statement. It was this fall after there had been new information and new conclusions by the chief pathologist making a new coroner's report. You wrote this just a few months ago in October, and the headline title for your piece was "After my brother's death in prison, my family has lost faith in the system." And we've talked a lot about those challenges, the roadblocks that never should have been there if justice was the goal of the justice system. But you said your final statement was, "We still believe in justice." And maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. You know, it's this is the academic in you, Dr. Hussein, in terms of, you know, the unraveling, the analysis of it. Yeah, and I deliberately wrote it that way because, you know, for many of us sometimes, and we all do it, people assume justice is just linked to accountability through like direct, almost like a knee-jerk reaction, blood for blood, right? Or this idea of, you know, violence for violence, right? Of a justice. But justice is much more, in my humble opinion, much more nuanced. And I want to unravel that sentence, explain justice for you in my humble way, to tell you why I said that. But justice is much more nuanced than that, in the sense that what foundations is your notion of justice built on? What is your justice hoping to achieve, right? And what does it mean for you to have justice, right? Soleiman's gone. That loss will never be replaced, Dr. Hussein. But as a man of faith, we also, you know, we accept what's given to us in terms of the destiny, right? Doesn't mean we just stay back and don't, because a wrong took place. There was a wrong that happened to my late brother. So we had to fight against that to articulate the wrong. But justice for us is spelled in the notion that these guards need to be held accountable and criminally charged. That's what the hope is. But that's not all of our justice.
Mm-hmm.
Our justice is built on love, Dr. Hussein, on this idea of building a society, love, dignity, and honor for people with mental illness. Every single guard who were involved in the beating death of Soleiman Faqiri, when they have dinner, when they're talking to their loved one, they have to live with this. There's a conscience that they have. That's what justice is about, right? You know, I myself, you know, I'm a firm believer that we will achieve our justice. I do. But I'm not going to put faith in my justice in a system that creates two-tier for, you know, for law enforcement and the rest of us. I'm going to link my justice to the strangers that have now become my family. And my justice, Dr. Hussein, will be that if I leave this earth, even if I don't see it, but maybe the fruits will bear, that people with mental illness will be treated with dignity by social workers and healthcare workers, with people with cultural competencies. That's my justice. That's what I meant by that sentence, right? Because I'll be bound to be disappointed if I'm going to tie my justice. I've got 5-year experience, Dr. Hussein, to know that I'd be disappointed. If we're really going to get justice, look at it 5 years later, right? But it would mean the world to me. And I hope I see it in my lifetime, but if not, I accept it. That maybe one day someone will utter Soleiman Faqiri's name or Ashley Smith's name or Justin Saint-Amour's name and say, look, our lives are better because of these people. That's justice. And that for me is the purest form of justice.
I think that's a really profound statement, and coming from the insight of your struggles with this campaign for justice, to define it in that way. And it's always seemed to me that while you were absolutely dedicated to and determined to hold people accountable through whatever levers the system afforded, and to keep pushing and pressing for that, that fundamentally there was a kind of higher purpose of forging that kind of solidarity to leave a legacy in your brother's name that will inspire others to try and change this system that you're petitioning, that you're pressuring, that you're demanding. But ultimately it's to change it, to make it a better society, and to fulfill those ideals in a genuine way, rather than this hierarchical, divided manner where there's different levels of accountability and justice for different people, but for everybody to be treated with the kind of human dignity that everyone does deserve. So I think that's a very important statement. You had mentioned in a few moments ago that, well, of course, Soleiman's story has its particularities and uniqueness because of who he was as an individual and what happened to him, that on some broader level, it's a common story. It's a shared experience. It's very tragically not so uncommon as it should be. And I think in general, you were talking about the collision between mental health and this carceral institution of the prisons. But I had one other thought about it, that I know you've highlighted the mental illness component, but Desmond Cole, the great journalist in Canada, had put out a blog post, I remember, in February or March 2020, right before the George Floyd protests emerged. And he had listed a number of cases of deadly, fatal encounters with the police, listing those who had been victimized by police violence, who were racialized, whether Indigenous people, Black people, people from the Middle East and South Asia. And one thing I noticed in the stories about them was the huge proportion of mental illness sufferers among them. And it seemed that in addition to mental illness, that an exacerbating feature and condition is the racial component. When you have both mental illness and a racialized person, that it leads to very, very deadly, fatal encounters. And that seems to be a relevant context in thinking about Soleiman's case. Do you feel in some ways that the fact that he was a Muslim Afghani male led to his treatment being so incredibly intensively violent at the hands of these guards? Did it play a role? Do you feel like it has? Because it seems to be connected with other cases where police or prison authorities, in terms of the differential treatment, it seems that it's even worse when it comes to mental health sufferers who are also racialized people.
I think it's an important question, Dr. Hussein, but the fact that we don't have most of that information in those 11 days in itself is a problem. I don't even know if you saw an imam, right, Dr. Hussein, in those 11 days, right? You saw on the podcast of how he was treated, right? It was a very violent end to his life. And so the fact that we try to see him and weren't able to see him is a problem, right? Those aspects, and then I want to talk about some of the stuff that Desmond and the stats you were talking. Dr. Hussein, you have, I think, about 30-40% women in the Canadian prison system are First Nations. You heard that right, 30-40%, and that number might even be higher, are women.
Mm-hmm.
The two largest, well, it's two of the biggest groups that are in prison for male are First Nations and members of Black Canadians. That's a problem. That's a problem, and that in itself, you have another layer to these tragedies. And then besides the prison, you have to talk about this as well. A lot of folks from racialized communities, Dr. Hussein, they come from war-torn countries, whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it's parts of the Arab world or the Muslim world, whether you're Syrian, Afghani, Rohingya. If you come from those countries, there's a higher percentage of your population that suffers from mental illness. Soleiman was Afghani. There's a correlation.
Well, I mean, trauma, right?
Yeah, right. We left early as kids, but we came. There's a direct correlation between mental illness and war, right? So and that also, and then on top of all this, when you talk about that trauma, there's another thing that we have a role to play. It's gotten better, but whether it's the Muslim community or some of the subcultural communities, the stigma of having mental illness from some of our communities. And I know a lot of us that are listening are saying, yeah, I can definitely relate, right? So because you're unpacking several things here, Dr. Hussein, that I think is also important for us to discuss, right?
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, getting back to your original comment and your question from a couple minutes ago, when you asked me, when we talked about the op-ed, it's the first time that I intimately talked about our life as Afghani refugees. You brought up the word legacy. And for me, all this work, ultimately, what I hope to do is this is our humble way giving back to Canada, giving back to Canadians in the sense that my brother already had a tragic life to begin with, and he had a tragic end. But I hope through that pain that we've seen all these years, escaping war is to also, this is our way of giving back to Canada, right? Because it's very counterproductive, sir, if your work is always tempered on anger. You could be firm and dignified. But when it's tempered on anger, you're going to undermine yourself. And that's been the hardest test for me all these years, Dr. Hussein. Because for me, it's a wide emotion, the letdowns, all that stuff. I was like, what am I supposed to do? We've tried to be humble and dignified, but the system still refuses to accept this wrong, right? Sorry for digressing, but I wanted
No.
to also highlight that.
Yeah, that's very important. Um, I guess at this point, I'm wondering. I know that you're preparing for listeners. We're recording on Friday, the 17th of December, and there is planned a vigil for Soleiman on the 5th anniversary in Toronto at Dundas Square at 6 p.m. And you're preparing for this vigil. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you hope will be accomplished at this vigil. And we can talk a little bit after that about which direction the campaign is going in, what it's hoping to achieve at this stage, and how our listeners can get involved in solidarity and support. But let's talk a little bit about the upcoming vigil. What do you hope to achieve? What's going to happen?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. The vigil this year will be a bit different from other years in that it will be done to highlight, to try to remember Suleiman, the man that he was, in that sense of like focusing on him in terms of like um, the brother, the son, but
Hmm.
tying in that, talking about the systemic issues, right? That there could have been another Suleiman, and it was just to like let people know, like one to remember, but also let people know that this campaign is live and well. We've been tested with with the various variants in the coronavirus. We haven't been able to go out. This will be, this will be our first physical event of 2021.
Mm.
And so this is to like inspire people that we're still out there. We do a lot of events, but it'll be good to be there personally, right? And so that's the second part. And the third part is to continue to inspire people, um, to know that we're going to fight with them, that we're with them together, right? Because we're hoping in the coming months, Dr. Hussein, to launch our family coalition of different families, right? We'll have a website. We're going to have pictures of different other victims. And so we have invited other families as well to speak, and we'll be collecting statements. We also have Desmond Cole, that's one of the speakers as well. There's a psychiatrist, and there'll be other families that will be speaking. Um, so that's will be the other the ultimate accomplishment is to say, is to come a night of solidarity and talk about Suleiman and the systemic issues, and basically a continuation of the work that we're doing. And we're hoping that it's a successful night. We've already had a very successful week, and then just a couple of days ago, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, 5 Canadian senators, Senator Lucie Moncion, Peter Beam, Senator Mary Coyle, Kim Pate, and Stan Kutcher put a joint statement standing in solidarity. You have Goratan Singh, who will be speaking as well, the Ontario Justice Critic. Sarah Jama is another speaker. Arfin Malik, she's a psychiatrist. So you'll note right off the bat, Imam Yassin Dwyer will start, which is very familiar to the audience, Canada's first Muslim prison chaplain. And it'll be, and we'll have some spoken word art, and then I'll be saying a few words as well. And then laying 50 roses. We'll be giving the audience 50 different roses, 50 roses, and then, because those are the 50 bruises, right? That Soli had, and then have a moment of silence for him and for all people that suffer from mental. And then we're going to end off the event with me saying some of the names that are articulated to you, Dr. Hussein. That's what the evening will be about.
Yes, well, I hope listeners will be attending if they're in the Toronto area. Is this going to be live streamed at all?
Yeah, the event will be on Facebook Live, and the event will also be on Instagram Live. Feel free, and we will also record the event.
How can people find out about those Facebook Live and Instagram streams? Where should they go?
They go for our Justice for Soli Facebook or Instagram Justice for Soli. And I know you've, and also they can go to your some of your social media that you've shared, and I know the Kingston Masjid is also sharing for people to come. But you could just go to our page and it'll automatically. And there's a lot of social media that we've already talked about the details of the vigil, where we've already advertised quite a bit.
It's clear that the campaign has really grown and had huge impact. We will put a link to that statement from the senators and also the information about Instagram and Facebook Live in the notes to this podcast so people can find out more and hopefully attend the stream if they can't attend in person. But how can people get involved, and what should people do if they want to express solidarity and support with the campaign Justice for Soli?
First and foremost, the most important thing everybody can do is pray for my late brother and pray for us to be successful in this journey.
Amen.
Because that's very important. That's the most important. And anybody who's listening, please, and your prayer would mean the world. In terms of direct involvement, we have an amazing team, talented folks that are students, but also come from different professional backgrounds, and that are supporting us. So you could email us as Justice for Soli, one word, justiceforsoli@gmail.com. We always have time for volunteers in different capacity, writers, social media, organizers. It would be an honor to have you involved, because this work all of us have a stake in. So that's one way. Another way for people to get involved is maybe after listening to this podcast with Dr. Hussein, maybe put out a statement, share this podcast, share about Soleiman's story. And then finally, another way, to help us, if you know someone who's suffering from mental illness, and I know at times we're all tested differently, is just listen to them, give them a hug, tell them you love them. And if you can't see them physically, call them. It would mean the world to them. And I say this to all of you humbly, to do that, because there's a lot of us that suffer in silence.
Yusuf, I want to thank you so much for sharing your brother's story, the story of the campaign to seek justice for him, and for your wise words and deep insights. I know it's not easy, so I very much appreciate you taking the time and the emotional labor that it takes to talk about these very difficult and painful experiences. We all pray and hope that some positive legacy will come from this. It already has. This campaign has changed many people's lives and is having a huge impact. So we wish you all the success and all the solidarity and support that we can show. And I want to thank you and acknowledge and recognize it's not easy to talk about these things. You've been talking unceasingly for 5 years, and that's a huge burden and a huge task. But you set an amazing example for us in struggling for justice, and we appreciate that greatly. Jazakallah for all the work that you've done, and may Allah give you strength and power to achieve justice and peace. Thank you again for talking with us.
Ameen Ya Rab. Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Hussein. I'm honored to speak with you. And if any folks that do need support, if you have someone, loved one that's suffering, please reach out to Dr. Hussein or reach out to that email. I'm happy to assist and provide any resources. We're in this together. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. And listeners, listen for future episodes coming very soon. We'll see you again soon on the Majlis.